let me start by asking you, the listener, a really direct question. Like, when you hear the phrase high taxes and massive welfare, what immediately pops into your head?
Right, it's a very loaded phrase.
Exactly. Because if you evaluate the world through, the lens of traditional classical economics, you probably picture a completely sluggish economy.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Standard assumption.
Right. You might envision the system that's just heavily burdened by bureaucracy, weighed down by individuals just kind of coasting on government handouts, and, well, utterly lacking the sharp, aggressive edge of global competitive drive.
Yeah, the assumption is that you are basically trading high performance and innovation for comfortable mediocrity.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We are going to put that specific assumption under a microscope because we're looking at a massive stack of data today that completely shatters it.
It really does. It's fascinating.
We are exploring what economists refer to as the Swedish Paradox. Our goal today is to uncover how Sweden, a country that is globally renowned for its expansive cradle-to-grave social safety net, somehow managed to simultaneously build one of the most ruthless, efficient, and highly competitive innovation machines on the planet.
And we are grounding this entire analysis in a very comprehensive longitudinal data report. This spans from 1960 all the way to 2024.
So we're talking over 6 decades of data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This isn't theoretical modeling. We're looking at actual World Bank data covering 15 core dimensions of national development.
We have data on adjusted net national income, carbon intensity, R&D spending, demographic shifts, global trade connectivity, you name it.
Yeah.
Institutional governance is in here too, and the reason you, listening right now, should care about this data set is, honestly, it's profound.
It really applies to almost any level of organization.
Yeah. Whether you are scaling a business or managing a diverse team, analyzing global markets, or just trying to understand how nations are going to survive the economic volatility of the 21st century, Sweden's historical data provides a literal blueprint.
It demonstrates empirically how social security and aggressive technological innovation do not have to be enemies.
Right. It totally challenges that zero-sum mindset that dominates modern political and economic discourse. We aren't taking any political sides here, by the way. We're just looking at what the numbers say.
Exactly. We were just imparting the facts from the report. By looking at a country over more than 6 decades, you can observe the tectonic plates of macroeconomics shifting beneath the surface. You can isolate which specific policies survived the stress tests of global crises.
And which ones drove compounding structural returns. So, okay, let's unpack this. To understand the mechanics of this, we first have to look at the macro picture. We need to look at the raw economic scorecard to establish that the Swedish paradox is backed by undeniable growth.
Right, let's look at the adjusted net national income per capita. And before we dive into the numbers, we should probably clarify the terminology here.
Yeah, please do, because we aren't just using standard GDP, right?
No, we're not. Using adjusted net national income, or ANNI, is a much more rigorous way to evaluate actual national prosperity. Gross domestic product, or GDP, simply measures the total value of goods and services produced within a country's borders.
Which is the one everyone always hears about on the news.
Right, but GDP has massive blind spots. It doesn't account for who actually takes that money home, and it doesn't account for the depreciation of assets or the depletion of natural resources.
So, if a country chops down all its forests and sells the timber, its GDP spikes for that year, but its actual long-term wealth has severely diminished.
Precisely. ANI adjusts for the depletion of natural resources and the depreciation of fixed capital. Furthermore, it measures the total income claimed by the residents of the country, regardless of where that income was generated globally.
Oh, interesting. So it tracks where the money actually ends up.
Yes. So when an economy relies heavily on multinational corporations bringing profits back home, ANI captures that reality much better than GDP. It is a far more accurate reflection of the true sustainable standard of living.
Okay, so looking at the data in constant 2015 US dollars, which is crucial because, it strips out the illusion of inflation over these decades, the ANNI per capita in Sweden grew steadily from roughly $23,000 in the 1960s to over $46,000 in recent years.
They essentially doubled the real tangible wealth per person.
While maintaining their massive welfare state. That's the crazy part.
And if we expand that to the aggregate national level, The total adjusted net national income climbed from around $170 billion in 1970 to nearly $480 billion by 2022.
Wow.
That represents compounding relentless growth over half a century, and it occurred alongside some of the highest personal income tax rates in the developed world.
Right, but long-term growth curves always look smooth when you zoom out far enough, right? I want to test this model by zooming in on a moment of sheer macroeconomic panic, like the 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis.
The Great Recession.
Yeah, because you only really know how strong a ship is when it hits a hurricane.
That is the perfect stress test. A highly interconnected, export-driven economy like Sweden's is theoretically incredibly vulnerable to a global liquidity crisis. When global markets seize up, demand for advanced exports plummets.
And the data shows they definitely took a hit. Their growth went negative, dropping around 4.9%. Actually, let me check. Yeah, a significant drop right in that crisis window.
Right, they didn't escape the initial shock.
But the fascinating part isn't the drop, right? It's the rebound. The dataset reveals an aggressive V-shaped recovery. By 2010, they were bouncing back with massive positive growth. It looks like they hit a trampoline while other advanced economies were still, scraping themselves off the pavement.
That V-shaped recovery is a crucial data point. It directly counters the narrative that expansive welfare states are inherently sluggish, bloated, and slow to adapt to market shocks.
Okay, I have to push back on the mechanics of this, though. Common sense kind of dictates that if the government guarantees your health care, your housing assistance, and generous unemployment benefits, the motivation to scramble and rebuild during a severe downturn would be diminished.
You're asking why they didn't just give up.
Yeah. Why didn't the Swedish workforce just coast on the safety net while the economy stagnated? How does the welfare state not act as a massive anchor during a recovery?
To understand that, we need to examine the psychological drivers of a macroeconomic recession, specifically a concept called growth resilience. The conventional wisdom you just outlined assumes that fear of destitution is the primary driver of economic recovery.
That's the classic sink or swim mentality, right?
Exactly. It assumes that if people are terrified of losing everything, they will work harder and accept lower wages, which allows the market to clear and businesses to recover.
Which sounds logical on paper.
But look at the actual behavioral economics during a crisis. Fear is incredibly destructive to an economy. In a system with a weak social safety net, what happens when a massive shock like 2008 hits?
Everyone panics.
Yes. Citizens are terrified of losing their health care, they fear plunging into poverty, and they worry about foreclosure. The rational individual response to that fear is to instantly contract. You stop going to restaurants, you delay buying a new car, you hoard whatever cash you have.
Oh, right. Economists call that the paradox of thrift, don't they?
Spot on. Everyone simultaneously decides to save money to protect themselves. And because consumer spending evaporates, businesses go bankrupt.
Which leads to more layoffs.
Which creates even more fear. The rational individual choice creates a collective economic catastrophe.
Wow. Okay, so how does Sweden break that cycle?
In Sweden, the baseline of survival is structurally guaranteed. If you lose your job during a global financial meltdown, you do not lose your access to high-quality health care. You have robust unemployment benefits, and importantly, you have access to active labor market programs, retraining, and placement services funded by the state.
So your personal downside risk is mathematically capped.
Precisely. The collective psychological panic is mitigated. Because the average consumer isn't terrified of falling into an endless abyss, consumer spending doesn't completely crater.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the social safety net acts as an automatic, counter-cyclical macroeconomic stabilizer.
Yes. It keeps a baseline level of capital circulating through local businesses, even when global credit markets seize up. It's not designed to make people so comfortable that they become lazy. It's designed to make them secure enough that they don't pull all their capital out of the domestic economy in a panic.
That completely reframes the welfare state entirely. Instead of viewing it as a charity program that drains the economy, this data suggests it functions like a massive, sophisticated shock absorber system on a vehicle.
That's a great analogy.
It absorbs the paralyzing impact of a crash, keeping the chassis of the economy intact, which allows the engine to start revving again the exact moment the external conditions improve.
It allows for an elasticity of recovery. But, a shock absorber only mitigates damage. To actually generate the forward momentum we see in the long-term G&I data, you need an exceptionally powerful engine.
Which brings us to the second dimension of our data set. If the welfare state is the shock absorber, what is the engine driving the actual growth? Based on the numbers, That engine is an obsessive, highly structured, and persistent investment in human capital.
Human brains.
Literally. A lot of nations talk about innovation in their political speeches, but the financial allocations here are staggering.
Human capital, especially in a post-industrial global economy, is the ultimate compounding asset. Sweden recognized very early on that relying on raw materials or standard manufacturing was just a dead end.
Let's look at the research and development expenditure. The data shows that Sweden's R&D expenditure consistently sits above 3% of its entire GDP, hitting 3.4% around 2020.
That is a massive allocation of national wealth.
It really is. It's specifically dedicated to funding laboratories, engineering programs, and advanced testing facilities.
And it's important to contextualize that 3.4%. Many developed nations struggle to hit even 2%.
Right.
When you allocate over 3% of your total economic output to R&D decade after decade, you aren't just funding isolated projects. You are fundamentally reorienting the national economy around the production of intellectual property.
But, money alone doesn't invent things. The data point that genuinely stands out to me here is the density of the talent utilizing that funding.
The researcher density.
Yeah. In 2001, Sweden had roughly 4,169 researchers per million people. By the more recent data points, like 2021, that number had nearly doubled, skyrocketing to over 7,700 researchers per million people.
That is an extraordinary concentration of intellectual firepower.
Think about the scale of that for a second. For a country with a population of just over 10 million people, having over 7,700 researchers per million is wild. It essentially means the entire nation operates like a giant, highly integrated, applied sciences campus.
It really does.
But this begs a structural question. You can't just mandate that people become researchers. You can't just snap your fingers. Where is this deep bench of highly technical talent coming from?
It definitely doesn't materialize spontaneously. It is the direct output of another massive, deliberate fiscal policy. This leads us to the data on education expenditure.
Okay, let's look at that.
The adjusted savings directed toward education in Sweden consistently hovers around 7% of their gross national income.
7% of GNI year after year.
And that isn't just funding primary schools and basic literacy. This represents universal access to high-quality tertiary education, extensive vocational training, and adult reskilling programs.
Wow.
And the mechanics of this are what we refer to as the innovation chain. You cannot sustainably throw 3.4% of your GDP at corporate R&D if you do not have the domestic workforce capable of executing that complex research.
Right, because if multinational companies can't find the engineers, they will just take their R&D budgets to a country where they can.
Exactly.
So how does the Swedish government ensure the talent is there? I look at this 7% education spend, and I have to wonder, lots of countries spend heavily on schools and still suffer from massive skills shortages or brain drain. What is structurally different about how Sweden deploys these funds?
The difference is integration. The Swedish model operates as a synergistic, closed-loop system between the public sector and the private sector. The government makes massive foundational investments at the base of the funnel, that 7% of GNI. By making higher education free and providing generous living stipends to students, they completely remove the financial friction of acquiring advanced skills.
So they eliminate the risk of taking on crushing student debt to study advanced engineering or biotechnology.
Exactly. This creates a remarkably deep, highly skilled talent pool. The private sector, whether that's a domestic startup or a massive multinational corporation, knows this talent pool exists.
Which acts like a magnet.
Yes. Therefore, they are highly incentivized to base their R&D operations in Sweden. The corporate R&D spending and the government education spending feed off each other. The private sector relies on the talent the public sector produces, and the public sector continuously updates its vocational and university curricula in close collaboration with industry leaders to meet the bleeding-edge demands of the global market.
It's a remarkably efficient manufacturing process, but instead of manufacturing cars, they are manufacturing the exact high-tech talent pool that the modern economy requires. They fund the laboratories, and they simultaneously fund the brains that work inside the laboratories.
And this loop requires immense political discipline. A politician might want to cut education funding to offer a short-term tax break for an upcoming election cycle, right?
No, happens all the time.
But building an innovation chain takes a generation. The 1960 to 2024 data shows a remarkable consistency in these investments, regardless of which political party holds the parliament. There is a deeply ingrained national consensus that human capital is their single most important export.
This brings us to a critical pivot in our deep dive. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you can train all the software engineers and material scientists in the world, and you can throw billions at R&D. But if your national economy is stubbornly stuck in legacy industries,
If you're building steam engines in the age of the microchip.
exactly. If those brilliant minds are tasked with building marginally better steam engines, all that capital is completely wasted. You have to point those brains at the right problems. And the third section of our data shows a dramatic, dynamic restructuring of Sweden's entire value chain.
This is the historical transition from what we can call blue-collar Sweden to digital Sweden.
Because if you look at the macroeconomic profile of Sweden in the mid-20th century, it was a traditional, resource-heavy manufacturing powerhouse. We're talking about timber, iron ore, heavy machinery, and steel production.
Very heavy, tangible industries.
Right. But the data shows a deliberate shift away from that traditional manufacturing base toward a service-dominated, hyper-advanced knowledge economy.
It is vital to note, however, that they did not simply abandon their manufacturing heritage. They didn't hollow out their industrial base like some other Western nations did. They evolved it upward.
They moved up the value chain.
Yes. If you look at the manufacturing sector itself, the data on high-technology exports is phenomenal. High-tech exports surged over the decades, peaking at over 53%, more than half of all the manufactured exports in recent years.
So the physical goods they still produce are highly complex, high-margin products. But the real explosion, the defining characteristic of the modern Swedish economy, is the digital sector.
The Information and Communication Technology sector, or ICT. This is where the structural pivot is most evident in the data.
Let's trace the trajectory of ICT service exports. In the 1970s, ICT service exports made up roughly 1% of Sweden's total service exports. Fast forward to 2022, and that number had shot up to a massive 20.7%.
Over a fifth of their entire service export market is now pure digital value.
We are talking about tens of billions of dollars in absolute terms. In 2022, it was over $23 billion.
Astounding.
I conceptualize this as the rise of invisible trade. 50 years ago, a successful Swedish export was something heavy. You loaded tons of specialty steel onto a freighter, or you rolled a Volvo off an assembly line.
Right.
Today, their most lucrative exports take up zero physical space. They are shipping codes, streaming protocols, gaming engines, patents, and algorithmic infrastructure across the globe through fiber optic cables. It's invisible, but it is infinitely more scalable than shipping iron ore.
And that pivot to invisible trade reveals a profound strategic self-awareness at the macroeconomic level. Decades ago, Swedish policymakers and industrial leaders realized a hard truth.
What was that?
They could never, ever compete globally on cheap labor.
Because their own welfare state made cheap labor illegal.
Exactly. By guaranteeing high baseline wages, strong union representation, and a robust safety net, they inherently priced themselves out of the race to the bottom.
If your labor force is expensive, you simply cannot compete in low-value, labor-intensive manufacturing. Emerging markets with vast, low-cost populations will undercut your prices every single time.
Sweden understood that the only way to justify an expensive, highly taxed workforce was to ensure that workforce was producing exceptionally high-value, highly complex output.
Yeah.
They were forced by their own social model to monopolize the absolute highest end of the global value chain.
It's like they said, we are legally required to be expensive, so we have to be smarter. The welfare state literally forced the innovation.
It created a structural imperative. And the transition was logical. They didn't just jump from mining iron ore to writing software overnight.
There was a stepping stone.
Yes, the high-tech manufacturing boom, developing advanced aerospace components, precision robotics, and heavily investing in telecommunications hardware through companies like Ericsson that served as the bridge.
Ah, okay.
The rigorous engineering culture required for that precision manufacturing laid the intellectual and institutional groundwork for their current dominance in global digital services. You don't get the digital infrastructure that creates a Spotify, a Skype, or a Klarna without the decades of telecommunications engineering legacy that paved the way.
They navigated a macroeconomic tech tree. They leveled up their heavy resource industry into precision engineering, and then they leveled up that precision engineering into pure, scalable knowledge work.
And they reallocated capital and labor continuously to stay at the frontier of that innovation.
Which brings us to a dimension of the data that usually contradicts rapid industrial and technological expansion. Historically, when a nation levels up its manufacturing and tech sectors to this degree, it requires massive energy inputs.
Huge amounts of power.
Right. And historically, industrializing a nation meant choking its atmosphere. Growth has almost always required burning fossil fuel.
The traditional industrial golden rule.
But the fourth pillar of our dataset shows that Sweden somehow broke that rule entirely. Let's examine the carbon decoupling. The data here is undeniable. Over this 60-year period, Sweden successfully doubled its economic output while drastically slashing its absolute carbon footprint.
The decoupling of gross domestic product from carbon emissions is arguably the most vital macroeconomic lesson for the 21st century.
The adjusted savings data regarding carbon dioxide damage as a percentage of GNI dropped consistently over the decades. It went from a significant economic liability to a fraction of what it was,
Let's look at their carbon intensity.
which is the amount of CO2 emitted per unit of GDP.
Right. In 1970, they emitted roughly zero point 0.4 kilograms of CO2 per unit of GDP. By recent years, that dropped below 0.06 kilograms.
So from point 0.4 down to 0.06, that is a profound structural achievement.
It proves that environmental protection and economic prosperity are not mutually exclusive.
Now, I have to press you on this because we hear this debate constantly. Whenever strict climate policies are proposed, the immediate counterargument is that it will destroy industrial competitiveness and kill the economy.
It is always framed as an unavoidable war between the environment and the GDP.
Exactly. So I want you, the listener, to think about your own country's struggle with climate versus economy for a second. And then I have to ask the expert here, did Sweden genuinely solve this puzzle domestically? Or is this a statistical sleight of hand?
What do you mean by sleight of hand?
Like, did they just offshore all their dirty, heavy manufacturing to developing nations in Asia, keep the clean software coding jobs in Stockholm, and then claim a green miracle while the global atmosphere still absorbs the pollution of the products they consume?
That is the cynical interpretation. And from an analytical standpoint, it is a very necessary question to ask. Offshoring absolutely plays a role in the carbon accounting of any post-industrial Western nation.
Right, because we buy things made elsewhere.
When you transition to a service economy, you are inherently outsourcing the carbon emissions of your consumer goods to the nations that manufacture them. However, if you look at the domestic data, offshoring is only a small part of the Swedish story.
Okay.
The real mechanism behind their carbon decoupling lies in their domestic energy grid.
The power grid data, let's look at that. It shows an incredibly heavy reliance on a dual engine of alternative and nuclear energy, representing roughly 50% of their total energy use.
Yes, they possess massive hydroelectric power infrastructure in the north, and they build a robust fleet of nuclear reactors, primarily in the 1970s and 1980s.
And in more recent decades, they have overseen a massive surge in wind and non-hydro renewable integration. I see here that non-hydro renewables went from like 1% in 1990 to over 24% by 2015.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is that they essentially decarbonized their baseline electricity generation decades before net zero became a trendy global talking point.
But why? If it wasn't a modern climate initiative, what drove that massive capital investment back in the 70s?
It wasn't driven by modern environmentalism. It was driven by ruthless, highly calculated economic survival. Consider the macroeconomic environment of the 1970s.
The oil shocks.
Yes, the global economy was paralyzed by massive oil crises and stagflation. Sweden, lacking any significant domestic fossil fuel reserves of its own, realized that relying on imported Middle Eastern oil to power its heavy industries was a massive, unacceptable strategic vulnerability.
So the pivot to nuclear and hydro wasn't about saving the polar bears at all. It was an economic hedge against global volatility.
Precisely. By transitioning to domestic nuclear and hydroelectric power, they achieved energy independence and extreme price stability. And here's how that connects back to the innovation engine.
Let's connect it.
It provided their high-tech manufacturing sector with a remarkably stable, low-cost, and low-emission energy foundation.
Right, because if you are running energy-intensive advanced manufacturing, or today, if you are running massive power-hungry server farms for your ICT sector, having access to cheap, reliable, clean power gives you a massive competitive advantage on the global market.
It was a convergence of environmental benefit and economic necessity. They proved empirically that clean infrastructure isn't a tax on growth. It becomes a profound economic moat.
If your high-tech exports are manufactured using clean energy, you are effectively immune to future global carbon taxes, and your products inherently appeal to a global market that is increasingly demanding sustainable supply chains.
The clean energy grid was the necessary infrastructure that allowed the economy to scale without suffocating itself or bankrupting itself on imported oil.
Okay, so we have analyzed the macro shock absorbers, the R&D engine, the digital transformation, and the clean energy grid. It sounds incredibly
It
robust.
is a formidable system.
But an advanced, high-tech, low-carbon economy still requires people to operate it. If the society fractures, if the population is sick, or if wealth inequality creates extreme polarization, the entire machine grinds to a halt.
The social consensus. It acts as the ballast for the entire economic ship. You cannot maintain long-term technological dominance if your domestic society is carrying itself apart.
Let's look at the social fabric through the lens of this World Bank data, because the numbers here are just as striking as the tech exports. First off, extreme poverty, which the World Bank defines as living on less than $3 a day, is essentially eradicated. It's at like 0.5%. It is a statistical ghost in the Swedish data.
Which is the fundamental promise of the welfare state realized. The absolute floor of human suffering is legislatively capped.
Then we look at life expectancy. It grew from roughly 73 years in 1960 to over 83 years today. A full decade of productive life added to the average citizen.
And they spend over 11% of their GDP on health to maintain that.
And then there is the Gini coefficient.
We should define the Gini coefficient clearly for the listener.
Good call.
It is a standard statistical measure of economic inequality within a population. The scale goes from 0 to 100. A score of 0 represents perfect equality, where every single person has the exact same income.
And a score of 100 represents maximal inequality, where one single person has all the income and everyone else has nothing.
Correct. So a lower number means a more egalitarian society. While many advanced developed nations have seen their Gini coefficient skyrocket over the last few decades as wealth concentrates at the top, Sweden's data shows them consistently maintaining a very low, highly compressed 25 to 30 range on the index.
Meaning wealth is distributed relatively evenly. The gap between the absolute top earners and the bottom earners is significantly compressed through progressive taxation and wealth transfers, at least compared to nations like the US or the UK.
Yes, it creates a much flatter societal structure.
But the data point I really want to focus on here is gender parity, specifically the high female labor force participation. This is often framed in political discourse purely as a moral or social justice victory, which it obviously is, we're not discounting that, but evaluating it strictly through the lens of macroeconomic data, it looks like a massive structural advantage.
It is a profound expansion of the national labor supply.
Think about the mechanics of it. If you have a society where traditional gender roles, or simply a lack of childcare infrastructure, dictate that women largely stay out of the professional workforce, you are literally benching 50% of your potential brain power.
You are discarding half of your potential engineers, researchers, and executives.
Exactly. Sweden implemented policies decades ago, heavily subsidized universal childcare, extremely generous and shared parental leave that made it not just possible but culturally normal for women to fully participate in the high-end labor force.
Look at the management statistics. By 2023, the share of women in senior and middle management positions reached over 43%.
Wow. They effectively doubled their domestic talent pool.
In a knowledge economy, where human capital is the only asset that truly matters, ensuring that women can advance in technical and managerial roles without sacrificing family life is a massive, structural, macroeconomic stimulus. They unlock the productivity of half their population while other nations held theirs back.
And when we synthesize all these social metrics together, the high life expectancy, the low Gini coefficient, the gender parity, we arrive at an economic concept known as inclusive growth.
Inclusive growth means that the expansion of the economy relies on, and benefits, the broadest possible base of the population. And the primary macroeconomic benefit of inclusive growth is social cohesion.
Why does social cohesion matter to the GDP, though? I can hear a skeptical listener saying, who cares if everyone likes each other as long as the factories are running?
Because a high-trust, cohesive society radically lowers transaction costs. When inequality is low and people trust the institutions, you spend significantly less national wealth on domestic security, less on mitigating social unrest, and less on endless litigation.
That makes sense.
But more importantly, it changes the population's fundamental relationship with risk.
Oh, this goes back to the safety net, reducing the personal downside of failure.
Exactly. Innovation requires risk. If you want to leave your comfortable corporate job to start a highly speculative tech company, that is an inherently risky move. 9 out of 10 startups fail.
Yep.
In a highly unequal country with a weak safety net, quitting your job to start a company means risking your family's health care, risking their housing, and facing potential financial ruin. That creates immense friction. It inherently discourages brilliant but non-wealthy individuals from taking a chance.
They stay in their safe, established jobs because the downside of failure is too catastrophic. The only people who innovate are the people who are already rich enough to survive a failure.
But in Sweden, the baseline is secure. If your ambitious startup goes bankrupt, you don't end up on the street. You do not lose your health care. Your children stay in excellent, fully funded schools.
The expansive social safety net smooths out the friction of a highly adaptable labor market. It actually encourages entrepreneurial risk-taking. People are willing to jump into the unknown because they know there is a net to catch them if they fall.
It is a masterclass in systemic design. However, an objective analysis requires us to look at the entire dataset. And if we flip to the latter sections of this 60-year report, we must confront the severe structural vulnerabilities threatening this model.
Right. So what does this all mean? No macroeconomic model is immune to reality. Having analyzed the mechanics of their triumphs, we have to look at the cracks in the ice. The trajectory for the coming decades shows some immense pressures that are actively threatening to unravel the Swedish system.
No system exists in a vacuum, and the demographic realities they are facing are unforgiving.
Let's talk about the old age dependency ratio. This metric measures the number of people aged 65 and over relative to the working age population. Back in 1960, this ratio in Sweden was 17.8%. By 2022, it had skyrocketed to an alarming 33.3%.
To clarify the math for the listener, that means for roughly every 3 working-age citizens paying taxes, there is 1 person of retirement age drawing from the system.
This is an enormous fiscal problem. It's the silver tsunami. If the dependency ratio keeps climbing, and with life expectancy pushing past 83, it absolutely will attend the Britmit. Who is going to pay the exorbitant taxes required to fund the welfare state?
This raises an important question. It is arguably the existential threat to the Swedish model in the 21st century. The modern welfare state was designed in the mid-20th century under a very specific demographic assumption.
Which was?
A broad, pyramid-shaped population with a massive base of young workers supporting a relatively small peak of retirees. That demographic pyramid is actively inverting.
You have a mathematically shrinking pool of young workers trying to support a rapidly expanding pool of retirees who require highly expensive medical care and long-term pensions. That math feels like a ticking time bomb. So how do they escape the math? Do they drastically slash pension and healthcare benefits, or do they raise income taxes to like 80 or 90% on the shrinking workforce?
From a political and economic standpoint, neither of those options is sustainable. Slashing benefits violates the core social contract, and raising taxes to confiscatory levels would trigger massive capital flight and brain drain. The only viable path forward for Sweden is to innovate its way out of the demographic trap.
You can't invent more young people. How do you innovate out of an aging population?
By utilizing extreme technological adoption to exponentially boost the per capita productivity of the workers you do have. If you have fewer workers, each individual worker must generate significantly more economic value to maintain the aggregate tax base.
Wow, okay.
This is why their current obsession with artificial intelligence, deep automation, and advanced robotics isn't just about maintaining a high-tech brand. It is a desperate macroeconomic race against demographic decline.
They must automate mundane and even complex tasks to free up their shrinking human workforce for only the highest value output. The innovation engine we discussed earlier is no longer just a luxury for growth, it is a demographic necessity for survival.
They literally have to invent and deploy the technology to replace the workers they aren't having, simply to generate the tax revenue needed to pay for the retirement of the workers they currently have.
That is an incredibly tight needle to thread. And there is another glaring vulnerability the data highlights, which is their extreme reliance on open global supply chains.
Yes. If you look at the import and export volume indices, they reflect a deeply interconnected, highly exposed economy. The Liner Shipping Connectivity Index, for instance, reflects how dependent they are on smooth global logistics.
Because Sweden is a nation of roughly 10 million people, They cannot possibly consume everything they produce, and more importantly, they lack the domestic natural resources and diverse manufacturing base to build everything they need.
They must import raw materials and subcomponents, assemble or integrate them using their high-tech intellectual property, and export the finished high-value products.
Which means if global trade seizes up, whether through prolonged pandemics, geopolitical conflicts, blocked shipping lanes, or rising global protectionism and tariffs, Sweden's economic engine is instantly starved of both its fuel and its market.
They are highly exposed to macroeconomic headwinds over which they have absolutely zero sovereign control. A prolonged trade war between massive global players sends shockwaves directly into the Swedish manufacturing and digital sectors.
They are walking a geopolitical tightrope, which brings us to a final, crucial question about the internal mechanics of this society. With all these pressures, the aging population, the global volatility, and the incredibly high tax burden, why do the citizens remain on board?
It's a fair question.
Why don't the highly skilled, highly taxed engineers and entrepreneurs simply leave for lower tax jurisdictions? Why doesn't the working class revolt against the system? The answer seems to lie in the data surrounding institutional governance.
To understand the psychology of the Swedish taxpayer, we have to look at the World Governance Indicators, or WGI.
The WGI data for Sweden shows exceptionally high scores across the board. For metrics like voice and accountability, regulatory quality, and incredibly strong anti-corruption measures, Sweden consistently ranks in the 95th percentile or higher globally.
This invisible institutional quality is the glue that holds the entire paradoxical structure together. Highly transparent, remarkably corruption-free governance is the foundational reason citizens are willing to hand over a massive percentage of their income to the state.
It is a fundamental, rigorously enforced social contract. The citizen says, I will give you half my paycheck, but only because I can track exactly where every single penny goes, and I possess absolute confidence that politicians and bureaucrats aren't stealing it or wasting it.
Exactly. Consider the alternative. If you attempt to impose a 50% tax rate in a country with high endemic corruption, where public funds routinely disappear into the pockets of connected insiders, or where infrastructure projects are bloated and inefficient, the social contract breaks immediately.
You get massive capital flight, widespread tax evasion, and the rise of a massive shadow economy because nobody wants to fund a corrupt machine.
But in Sweden, the return on investment of that tax burden is visible, tangible, and validated every single day. You pay high taxes, but in return you experience pristine public infrastructure, world-class schools, functional and accessible health care, and a clean environment.
Furthermore, the high regulatory quality means the rules of the market are fair, predictable, and consistently enforced, which provides the stability that businesses crave.
So the high level of trust isn't just some quaint cultural quirk of Scandinavia. It is a rigorously maintained, highly valuable institutional asset.
Because if that WGI score drops, if bureaucratic corruption creeps in, or if the public services begin to noticeably degrade, the willingness to pay those high taxes vanishes. If the tax base revolts, the welfare state goes broke, the innovation engine loses its funding, and the entire macroeconomic model collapses.
It is an incredibly delicate, highly interconnected equilibrium.
Which brings us to the end of this deep dive into the 1960-2024 dataset. Let's synthesize the mechanics of this journey. We started by questioning the Swedish paradox, how expansive welfare and high taxes coexist with hyper-efficient innovation.
And by unpacking the data, we've identified the three core pillars that enabled their transition from an industrial resource economy to a global digital powerhouse.
The first pillar is innovation as a structural imperative. Their relentless compounding investment of over 3% of GDP in R&D and 7% of GNI in education isn't just about national prestige. It is the only viable strategy for a small, heavily taxed, aging population to maintain global relevance and high living standards.
They recognized they had to monopolize the absolute bleeding edge of the value chain.
Right. The second pillar is the green transition as a competitive economic baseline. The data proves that decoupling GDP growth from carbon emissions wasn't merely an environmental crusade. It was a highly strategic economic maneuver initiated by the oil crises of the 1970s.
By securing a low-cost, stable, clean energy grid through nuclear and hydro, they provided their advanced digital and manufacturing sectors with a massive competitive moat in the global market.
And the third, and perhaps most vital pillar holding the entire structure up, is the social consensus, the transparent, corruption-free governance The gender equality policies that unlocked half of their potential workforce, the focus on health outcomes, and the expansive safety net that actually encourages entrepreneurial risk by capping the downside of failure.
This deeply ingrained social trust is the foundational bedrock that makes the massive investments of the first two pillars possible.
It is a masterclass in macroeconomic and systemic design. The real lesson here for you, the listener, whether you are analyzing your own corporate structure, your community, or the long-term trajectory of your country, is not a simplistic political debate about welfare versus free markets. That binary argument is a total distraction.
The real lesson embedded in this data is about the necessity of making fearless, systemic, and long-term investments in future technologies and human minds.
It is about building strong structural shock absorbers, so your people have the security and the confidence to take the risks necessary for growth. It requires recognizing that social security and aggressive innovation are not mutually exclusive forces.
When the institutional architecture is designed correctly, they actively fuel each other.
But I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over as you analyze this data. We've established empirically that the Swedish system is an undeniable, data-driven macroeconomic triumph over the last 60 years. But as we just discussed, it functions precisely because it is built upon a bedrock of incredibly high social trust, extreme institutional transparency, and cultural homogeneity regarding the social contract.
That level of institutional trust is a legacy that takes centuries to build and is extraordinarily difficult to artificially manufacture.
So ask yourself this. If you took this exact economic blueprint, the high taxation, the expansive welfare state, the heavily subsidized innovation chain, and you tried to copy-paste it into a country that fundamentally lacks that deep historical cultural trust, a nation where political institutions are viewed with deep suspicion, where corruption is tolerated, and where societal cohesion is fractured, would that imported blueprint create a utopian innovation machine? Wait, let me rephrase that. Would that imported blueprint create a utopian innovation machine, or would it instantly collapse under its own weight, paralyzed and bankrupted by the very system designed to protect it? Think about that. Until next time, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.